Hey guys, welcome back. This time we're going to take a look at a few of the games on the Super NES that blew me away with their graphics, gameplay, or just the fact that they could even exist on the Super NES when they came out. Obviously, it was very easy to be impressed with the graphics of the Super NES just due to how big of a jump it was from the NES. But the advances in gameplay and what was possible on the system was just as big with a lot of games, so I figured these would be fun to talk about. This is also just part one of this list as well, since I'll be back next week with a few more. Anyway, let's get started with a follow-up to one of my favorite NES games, one that nearly put me on the floor from just how awesome it was when I first played it. Super Castlevania IV for the Super NES was the first game for the system that really showed off what all those extra bits could do. For as cool as Super Mario World was, it really wasn't much of a showcase for all the neat things that the Super NES was capable of. Castlevania IV came along though and absolutely blew my mind with just about everything that it did. When I originally saw previews in magazines, I can't say I was really that all impressed. But that was because those magazine pictures weren't moving. In motion, Castlevania looks fantastic, especially compared to the NES games. The sprites were twice the size, everything was animated way better, and the stages themselves just felt more alive. To tell you just how much I needed to go touch grass back then, the first time that I went into one of these gates in the first level and came out the other side of the screen made me audibly excited. It was just really unexpected, and it's just something you didn't see on the NES, and the rest of the game's filled with stuff like that. It wasn't just the graphics that amazed either. The gameplay was a complete overhaul of what Castlevania had been doing for years on the NES. Gone is the weirdly heavy character physics of those games that resulted in more than a few controllers thrown across the room. Now replaced with a much more nimble version of Simon Belmont, one that could, get this, actually swing his whip in different directions. And the first time that you used your whip to swing across platforms was basically just the game showing off at that point. This completely changed how the game felt, finally making it seem like you had more than enough options to get past any obstacle in the game just as long as you mastered Simon's controls, and that wasn't always the case on the NES version. Super Castlevania IV became the standard bearer for action games on the system for me. It was so good in just about every way that it set an almost impossible bar for other games that I played on the Super NES to reach, let alone surpass. Castlevania IV is so good that even future Castlevania games couldn't surpass it. To me, this is the best traditional Castlevania that's ever been released. And if you've somehow missed out on this one, then do yourself a favor and jump on it as soon as possible. This is the game that sold me on the Super NES, and it's still just as good today. Street Fighter Alpha 2 on the Super NES is a game that technically has no right being on the system. By the time Street Fighter Alpha 2 came out on the Super NES, I was already playing the PlayStation port every hour that I could. So when I went over to my mom's house one night and saw that my brother had rented Street Fighter Alpha 2 on the Super NES, I couldn't believe it. First off, I didn't even know that it had been ported to the Super NES. And second, how the hell was this even possible? Street Fighter Alpha 2 is pretty heavy graphically, even in the arcade. The characters were huge and incredibly well animated, with tons of stages that all had their own animations and things going on. Even the mighty PlayStation and Saturn versions had some animations cut out of it to fit in their respective consoles. So there's no way this game could possibly be on the Super NES and even resemble Street Fighter Alpha 2, right? Well, if you squint your eyes, you may be fooled into thinking that this is the real deal. Somehow Capcom managed to squeeze everything from the arcade version of the game into a tiny Super NES cartridge that only has a fraction of the memory available to it. Every character, every stage, every story beat, hell, even the full arcade intro is here. Seriously, when this intro came on back then, my jaw dropped. I couldn't believe what I was seeing on the Super NES. Now obviously, some corners had to be cut to get this to work. Character sprites are much smaller, and a good chunk of the animation frames are gone, and the screen is squished at the top and the bottom. Probably the biggest downgrade though is that this is the only Super NES game that I'm aware of that actually has to load. Twice before the first round even. A pause before the match, and then another pause right when the fight text goes away. I can honestly deal with that initial pause, but the one right after the fight text goes away really gets in the way of the flow of the matches. And yes, it does this every round. There's also a pause as it loads in victory animations, but really that one's not too bad. If you put all of these things to the side though, you're left with a perfectly good version of Street Fighter Alpha 2. It plays just fine, and I guess that's what's important. And the fact that it's doing this on the Super NES is still mind-blowing. Now obviously, I don't think this is the version of the game that you should play if you actually want to play Street Fighter Alpha 2, but the Super NES version is a hell of an oddity that shouldn't, but somehow does, exist. Axelay on the Super NES was another one that wowed with its crazy special effects. Axelay was definitely one of those games that got my attention solely based on the pictures on the back of the box. Coming from the NES, a game looking this good just didn't seem possible. And in case you haven't noticed by now, Axelay's a shooter. And if you've been watching my videos recently, you know that I stay far away from these things. I just wasn't ever very good at them. But Axelay looked so good on the back of that box that I just had to try it. And I'm really glad that I did, since Axelay ended up becoming one of my favorite games on the Super NES. First off, yes, those graphics are amazing. Axelay's using some really cool Mode 7 effects on its 3D stages, which makes them look like they have actual depth, which is something that a lot of Mode 7 games never accomplished. Maneuvering through rock formations while you see the planet beneath you flying by, or making your way through a maze of pipes with a massive city in the background was really something to behold. Even the standard 2D stages look great, with some nice use of scaling and rotation at just about every turn. It's definitely a looker. Besides the graphics, Axelay plays mostly like your standard shoot-'em-up does. You pilot your ship through hordes of enemies and bosses, dodging a billion bullets all over the screen in the process. And like I said, it's pretty standard stuff. What makes Axelay stand out is that there's no power-ups in the stages. This alone is almost heresy, since most shooters are all about powering your ship up through finding power-ups throughout the stages. Axelay's a little bit different though, as it lets you pick your entire arsenal before you even begin a stage. At first you only have 3 weapons to choose from, but you get more as the game goes along. And all of these weapons act very different, so it's up to you to figure out when it's best to switch between them. The downside being that if you get hit, you lose that weapon until the next stage, so you better get good at learning when to switch and when not to. This alone made me really like Axelay. I loved being able to choose what I wanted before the stage, knowing I was as powerful as I could be. It was just up to me to figure out the stages to get better at them. None of that annoying power-up hunting that drives me crazy in just about every other shooter out there. So yeah, I think you can tell that I like this one. And it's a damn shame that Konami never gave it a sequel, because I would have been right there with my money in hand. I've heard this one called a glorified tech demo over the years, but I really think the gameplay holds up. It may not have the super high difficulty level of your standard shooter, but honestly that's one reason that I liked it so much. It just felt more accessible. So if that's not your thing, then maybe stay away. But if you like shooters with some crazy Mode 7 graphics, then definitely give Axelay a try. I'm at least glad that I did. Donkey Kong Country for the Super NES was impossible not to be wowed by. This is maybe the first game that I remember being pushed like it was a big deal. Every magazine had massive previews for it, with everyone gushing over those hot pre-rendered CG graphics and animations. Nintendo even released a VHS tape that you could get for free when you rented a game at your local video store, hyping it up. Literally everyone was talking about Donkey Kong Country. And when it finally released, I can say that it definitely lived up to the hype, at least for me anyway. The graphics alone were jaw-dropping for the time. For some perspective, these kinds of graphics are basically what we were being told was only possible on next-gen systems that had way more horsepower. Donkey Kong Country was Nintendo's attempt to say, hey kid, you don't need those fancy new consoles to get graphics that look like this. So why not stick with your old buddy Nintendo, at least until we finally release our next-gen system anyway. Honestly, it was a good argument, as Donkey Kong Country looked as good as anything out there. The problem though was that those graphics was all Donkey Kong Country had to push that claim. If you pulled all that shiny CG away, this was yet another Super NES platformer, one of hundreds. Admittedly, it's a very good platformer, but it's still just a platformer. And once the previews of those fully 3D Saturn and PlayStation games started rolling in, Donkey Kong Country started looking pretty basic, no matter how good those graphics were. The crazy thing is that I think Donkey Kong Country has probably aged the worst in terms of just how it looks compared to other Super NES games now. Playing it these days, it just looks muddy and overly dark most of the time. And God forbid you don't play this on a CRT monitor or an old TV, because man, it just looks butt ugly sometimes. But I still really enjoyed Donkey Kong Country a good deal. It was definitely one of those you had to be there moments in video gaming, and for what it's worth, I'm glad I was. And that's going to do it for this week. I think all of these games were really great examples of what the Super NES was capable of when it was put into the right hands. It really felt like anything was possible on that system when it was released. As mentioned, this is only part 1 of this video, so check back next week for some more games on the Super NES that really wowed me back then. As for this one, be sure to give it a like if it didn't immediately disgust you, and maybe even a sub if you really like me, because I sure like you. And I definitely like that you watched all the way to the end of this video, so thanks for watching. And be sure to check back next week for some more games to talk about.